This is Vic Chopra of Unincarcerated Productions, and you're listening to Justice Delayed.
You decide what you want to be when you grow up.
When most people think of prison, it is possibly the last place they would consider to be the birthplace of meaningful, supportive relationships. Yet, for many incarcerated individuals, prison can be an incubator for even the most unlikely of friendships. Cullen Thomas experienced this when he was sent away to a South Korean prison. Now an accomplished writer, Cullen examines and discusses his unexpected friendship with a fellow prisoner with someone who knows all about the subject, our host Billy Sinclair. For more about this episode, here's Jody.
Hello, and thanks for being with us today. But before we start, we want you to know this podcast comes with a warning. It's full of information about doing time that can be highly disturbing. Now, if you stay, 2 award-winning literary ex-cons will open prison cell doors for you in a no-holds-barred conversation that ricochets back and forth, sometimes in and out of sequence, as they compare their brutal experiences, still, in some ways, trying to understand them. As you know from this podcast's introduction, my husband, Billy Sinclair, is an award-winning inmate writer who spent 40 years behind bars. You will hear in heart-rending detail about Billy's friend, a best friend, another inmate who begged him for loyalty as that inmate committed suicide in the cell next to Billy's. Cullen Thomas, also a former inmate and celebrated writer, did time in a South Korean prison after being arrested for buying drugs. You'll hear his story about the Colombian drug runner locked up with him, who helped him survive, and how murder ultimately claimed that man's life.
Cullen, you were 23 when you went to prison in a foreign country. I was 21 when I ended up behind bars in a United States prison. And you got out and you wrote a book called Brother One Cell. Your articles have appeared in New York Times, USA Today, GQ, The Rumpus, Penthouse, Foreign Policy, and The Daily Beast. You've appeared on National Geographic Channel, MSNBC, and CNN. Now you teach writing and literature at New York University and the Gotham Writers Workshop. Cullen, you should know that during my last years in prison, I was in a cell block with the Colombian hitman that assassinated Barry Seal in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in February of 1986. That hit was carried out on orders of Pablo Escobar. Barry Seal, you will recall, was a commercial airline pilot turned major drug smuggler for the Colombian cartel, who later become a DEA informant. We have that in common. We both knew Colombians tied to the drug cartels. You've had a wide range of experiences in writing, and now you're currently working on a book that's about prison friendship. That's a unique subject, and I'm sure an extraordinary one for you because you have to go back and relive a lot of aspects about that friendship. And that's what we want to talk to you about today. Tell us about how the friendship began, sort of what it entailed, and how you look back on it today as you write about it.
Thanks, Billy. It's great to be here and speak with you again. Yeah, it's interesting to hear you and Jody talk about how we don't hear enough of these stories about the humanizing relationships that inmates can form. But, it's a very distinct kind of friendship. I think you might agree, Billy, in terms of, I just never before had met anyone like him and haven't since met anyone like him. It certainly was never something that I thought that I would sort of meet this, in some ways, classic prototype of the Colombian emerald and cocaine smuggler, kind of a character now out of popular mythology, what they talk about as narco culture. But he possessed all of the wonderful qualities of any good friend I had made growing up in an, middle class, upper middle class suburban neighborhood outside New York City. He had all of the same recognizable positive qualities as the guys I went to high school with, a private, all guys Catholic high school, with a real stress on education and athletics and, interestingly, moral character. But he had all of that. He was curious, he was kind, he was charismatic. He was a couple of years older than me when I met him. So I was 23. Billy, it's interesting where you were saying you were 21. I forgot how young you were at that point, even younger than I was. But for me, it was, a radical departure. I never imagined, stupidly, did not anticipate the the contingency of being caught and being stopped in my tracks and actually having to be accountable, which is a good and fair thing. So I was beside myself as I was arrested and brought into the Seoul Detention Center. So this is the summer of 1994. And he was in the cell next to me, this Colombian who's just a couple years older than me, 25. And he had already been in prison in Korea at that point for 4 years. So he knew the lay of the land. He spoke Korean and we just hit it off. We just found some kind of kindred bond. But this is something, Billy, also I wanted to ask you about to get some insight, frankly, in terms of what I'm writing. Right now it's a feature. It's a magazine feature that I hope it could grow into a book, I think. But one thing I've been navigating that I thought, would be really interesting to talk to you and Vic about in terms of how to present these characters on the page in a story.
I think the best way to speak to that, Cullen, is you have a collection of memories about the individual. So one of the best ways that I found to present someone is not so much through the narrative, but through the dialogue that you've had with this person. The dialogue he will tell the reader a lot about himself. And obviously, if this guy was in prison 4 years at the time you met him, which meant he was around 21 when he went in.
Right.
He was a well-seasoned and mature individual, not only in an educational sense, but in what we would term as a street sense. He knew how to survive in a culture that could be extremely dangerous, could even be violent. And yet he has this ability to be in a foreign prison to adjust, to learn the language, and has the moral character and the moral fiber of being to see someone like yourself who he feels that he can become friends with, that he can help. And so that's what you got to capture. That's what you got to deal with. And I think you will deal with that a lot in dialogue between you and him. And that may encompass taking scattered conversations that you had with him over a period of time and condensing them into a dialogue that accomplishes what you want to accomplish so that the reader will see who he is.
Yeah, that's great to hear, Billy. As I said before, just you and Jody and your careers in journalism and broadcasting and writing is very impressive. That's really helpful, Billy. I have letters. I'm lucky to have a bunch of letters which allow me to have his voice, but I was struck also just by the intensity of those bonds. I was searching for a term as I am writing. I'm about done with part 1. Right now, it's about 8,000 words, and I imagine there's a part 2. So it's sort of like a long feature at this point. It'll be around 12,000 words, I imagine. Could grow into a book, perhaps. But very thankful to have that source material, the letters for sure, to be able to recreate it.
That's great.
One thing obviously, when you talk about this Colombian that you met, all of the attributes that he had to have spoken English, and he must have written you letters in English, which indicate he was a very well-educated person.
Yeah, he was, see, here's what I'm wrestling with though. And Billy, these are some of the, I will definitely learn from you here today. So yes, he was all of those things. So the context, I feel like, in which these prison friendships happen, it's so interesting because the context is so specific, you know? It's like I knew him, I lived next to him, so we spent 5 months every day together in some way, shape, or form, if only having our blind conversations from cell to cell through the bars, right? Without seeing each other. That was most of our conversations, looking out the bathroom cell windows, which were next to each other, barred windows, and looking out above the high white wall and then out onto Anyang City. But you get to know these people in such a specific context. So for me, in now telling his story, it's become an investigation into those blank spaces that exist before I met him and the blank space of what happened to him in between his release back into the free world. And then when we got back in touch 15 years later, which was shortly before he was murdered. And that's sort of the rough chronology of the story. After being this incredible person in my life, he definitely saved my sanity and gave me strength to steel myself, because he was on the tail ends of his sentence, which was 5 years for smuggling emeralds and cocaine. And I was just starting 3.5. So he was going to be transferred out. And so we had only those few months, but he was, as I described it, he was evidence to me that I wouldn't go insane, that I could keep my mind, that there was still decency, which is one of our themes here, right? That there was honor and still decency. He was just an incredible character. He was incredibly charismatic too, but there were other sides to him. And this is what I was going to ask you, Billy. You know, you said something to me in that interview we did. There were a few things you said in there which I appreciate all the more because they're not just simple answers. For example, you know, you said you expressed that desire to put prison behind you. And I think you even used that metaphor. You talked about, you know, I didn't want to carry that wagon still. And I respect that and I feel that myself. And that was part of what made it difficult to stay friends with him on the outside, and which holds me back, because the crux of the story, there's a climactic moment where after we reconnect, we're now 40 years old. We're no longer the young, reckless.
You're grown men.
Yeah, we're older now, and he's got a family. He's in Spain. He says his wildest dreams have come true. He is more, you know, has this incredible success. He's a race car driver, and he tells me to come visit him. And this is sort of a big point in the story. Come visit me. Come to Spain. You'll stay in my house. We'll reminisce. We're brothers. We went through this thing. The bond was still there. You know, I still had a lot of love for him, but something gave me great pause. And that's sort of the crux of the story, which is something made me pause. And I thought, Billy, about you talking about, it's that thing of, wait a second now, I might love these people and that war, that battle we fought together, but now I need to put that behind me. And that's a tough thing, isn't it?
It is, because Pete and I was fortunate that when I was released and I had a relationship with Pete after I got out, it had been 20 years that had passed from the time because he got out 20 years before me. So when I got out, he was a long haul truck driver. I was working for a law firm, but we had this shared background. And so it was easy to have a relationship with Pete because there were new things that we could do together that were not prison. We used to have, me and Pete, Jody's son, Hugh, would go for a buffet. And those people at the buffet would see us coming. And, we didn't have a buffet in prison. So we literally took advantage of all the things that were available. So it was so many little light moments like that when we would say, they know we're coming. They see us coming, that you get to share that are not like a prison relationship. Let me speak very briefly to one friendship, and that was Billy Ray White. He's the friend that killed himself in a cell block, and I was next to him in the next cell when he did it. And I was part of that whole death process. But the relationship, the loyalty and the intensity of that relationship sometimes made me afraid because I never knew if I could measure up to the type of loyalty that he had for me. There's no doubt in my mind that Billy Ray would have died for me at any given moment that he felt I was threatened or that I was in danger. And I never quite knew if I could return that kind of life-altering loyalty. And when he died and I knew he was dying, he had made me give my word that I would not call out for help. I would just let him die. And that was a difficult position to be in. And he had put me in that position and I had to deal with it. And I had to deal with the fact when the guard passed the last time the cell that night, which is about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, I knew that was the last opportunity for me to stop the death or let it go forward. And I let it go. And to this day, Cullen, I do not know if I did the right thing. I do not know if I should have stopped it or if I did the right thing in terms of the relationship I had with him and let it go. So friendships in prison define us in many ways. And that's what this Colombian smuggler did for you. He put you in a situation that you were young in life, but throughout the next 15 years after you were out, you changed a whole lot. You had a whole lot of different experiences. And then I think you wondered after that 15 years, if you saw him again, would you measure up? He's obviously had a lot of success in the 15 years that he's been free. You've had a lot of success, been a whole different area, a whole different spectrum. Yeah. So would the friendship be the same? I know that if Billy Ray and I had been friends, had got out at the same time, let's say in 2006, we could not have shared friendship because he would have went one way, I would have went the other.
Interesting. Is that the dividing line is going back into the criminal world or breaking from it, right?
Yeah. I mean, when I got out, I was asked to go speak to a number of inmates who were in the Harris County Jail in Houston. And these were death penalty attorneys who wanted me to go speak to their clients to tell them the difference between a life sentence and a death sentence, what they could expect if they pled guilty to life, and what they could expect if they decided to roll the dice and run the risk of the death penalty. But going back and visiting with them, the smell, the sound, particularly the sound of that metal, doors constantly open, conversations that were way too loud. The whole sound and dimension of the jail came back. And it's like I told Jody after. And then in the back of my mind, I had to fear, what if one of these guards decided to set me up, to say I had drugs, to say I was doing this or I was doing that. The prison paranoia came back instantly, just like that. It was back. And I went in that survival mode and I told Jody, I can't do it anymore. I can't go back into that prison mentality. And that's the same obstacle that you faced when you got back in touch. No, you had all the letters through all the years, but you didn't know, I don't believe, if you could cross that line and go back to where y'all were in those adjacent cells. I think you didn't know, and I think that created a certain trepidation about what the relationship would be 15 years later.
Yeah, Billy, your stories are just amazing. I mean, I'm just blown away by all of your stories, all of these different relationships. Please tell me again the name of your friend who, and I'm assuming, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I'm trying to think of, the forensics of it. Did he hang himself with?
No, his name was Billy Ray White.
Billy Ray White.
Yeah, Billy Ray was one of the most feared inmates in Angola. I had previously met him in the Terre Haute Federal Prison, and he and I got to know each other. And so when I arrived at Angola, put on death row, he had been convicted of a robbery charge in New Orleans. So he was at Angola in 1968 while I was still on death row. Well, by the time I had been released, I was released from death row in 1972. And the time he had been in the prison, he had established quite a reputation, one that he had in the federal system and the free world. Now, you have to understand Billy Ray's background. Billy Ray was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list for a double murder that he committed during an armed robbery. Prior to that, he was living in Illinois and had been called to Albuquerque, New Mexico by a drug dealer named Pete Garcia. And Pete was having some trouble with the rival drug smuggling operation there in Albuquerque, and he needed some help. So he called for Billy Ray. To show you the Billy Ray mindset, he didn't hesitate. He left Illinois and he went to Albuquerque. And based upon what he told me, he killed 3 people in Albuquerque for Pete. Well, he had a close relationship with Pete because in Terre Haute, Pete Garcia had killed an inmate, and there was one inmate witness to that killing. And that was the only evidence that the government had to try Pete. Pete was in lockdown waiting to be tried, and he got word to Billy Ray, and Billy Ray took that inmate out. So this is the kind of determined and dangerous individual Billy Ray could be. But around me, he was like your friend. He was charismatic. He was intelligent. He had a presence about him. He had the ability to look at any man and not show an ounce of fear. The face would not flinch. The eyes would not blink. He had the ability through a stare and a presence to make people back down.
Well, I imagine some of that is he was, I won't necessarily say comfortable killing, but right, he sounds like a fearless individual in the sense that he's also taken many lives.
Yeah. He once mentioned to me, he said, I never killed a person, and he didn't quite call him a person. And he wasn't referring to the couple he killed in the robbery. He was referring to other people, the characters. He said, I never killed a motherfucker that didn't deserve it. And he truly believed that. But he could be, if you want to use the term, life of a party, because he loved to laugh, he loved to joke, and he was a great individual. But he was so fiercely determined that when he killed himself, he was in a cell and I had a mirror where I could look out and watch the process take place. And he slit, with his left hand, he slit his right wrist. But it wasn't good enough because the blood from the cut made it difficult. So he took the razor and he slit his left wrist. And then he literally, Cullen, chewed the veins out of his arm and spit them into a bucket that he had sitting there of warm water so he could put his arm in that water to keep the blood flowing so it wouldn't coagulate. He wanted to make sure that the blood would flow. And over the next 3.5 to 4 hours, he slowly bled to death. And during that time, he and I talked through these cells and we shared our life experiences. Everything that he believed I could be. Like he told me, he made me give him my word that I would walk away from the criminal mindset, from what was called in the convict code. He said, you're so much better than these people. You can rise above this. He said, I can't. He said, I will either die in prison in a knife fight, or if I get out, I will die in a shootout with the police, or somebody will kill me as I've done others. He said, so there's no future for me. And he said, there's a future for you. So it's against that backdrop that I had to watch him die. And it was one of the most difficult things in the world to do, to know that you have someone's life in your hand. I could have stopped that. I could have called out to the man to come say, get this guy some medical help. And, I didn't do that. And I've talked to Jody about it a number of times. And, she's been a source of comfort there. But, I'm 76 years old to this day. And to this day, I still look back on that with that happened in 1974. I still look back with a profound sense of uncertainty, of regret as to what I should have done. And, so I know how intense those relationships can be.
Yeah, what a powerful story. Billy, did you write about that in A Life in Balance?
Yes, I did. I wrote about it in Balance.
In a similar fashion? I mean, that's a devastating story that you spoke during those 3 or 4 hours as he bled out.
Yeah.
I
wrote about it in Balance, and I'm currently working on another manuscript, and it has to be included in this manuscript, but I'm approaching as much as possible from a different perspective. When Jody and I wrote that book, and believe me, Jody had a big hand. Jody guided me through that process because it was a difficult process to get through. And she would provide me with encouragement and perspective because she was writing it in Houston and I was writing it in a prison cell. So, I don't know if I could have got through that particular chapter, that particular episode, if it had not been for her.
I mean, that's just a powerhouse.
Well, Billy told me in the times that he has talked to me about Billy Ray, and there is a picture of Billy Ray White in Life in the Balance, and there is the letter that he wrote to Billy before he took his own life. And if you look at it from that perspective, the greatest gift that Billy Sinclair could give to Billy Ray White was to let him go. Because Billy has told me in the past, Billy Ray used to tell him, there's no place for me in the free world, and there's no place for me here. He had come to that conclusion. And that was the one thing, and he wrote in the letter, brother, that's how he addressed Billy, brother, please help me. So Billy told me about a time when they met at the federal penitentiary. Apparently, some people attacked Billy Ray in the cafeteria or something. And
it was in the process of fixing to have a fight when he pulled a knife on him. And I was sitting there at a table eating, and I saw the exchange fixing to take place, and I saw the guy go behind him to pull the knife out, and I reached and grabbed they had sugar shakers on the table. And I was able to grab that sugar shaker and pitch it. And I didn't know Billy Ray from Adams. And I pitched it to him. He caught it with one hand and come down and caught the guy to the side of the face, which stopped the guy's attack. And of course, then by that time, the prison guards and all that saw the beat taking place, and they came running and broke the matter up. He always believed that I saved his life that day.
What made you do that, Billy? What made you throw that sugar shaker to him?
I don't have the slightest idea, except I didn't know what they were arguing about in the line. Billy Ray wasn't one to argue. I saw when he turned in a posture, I knew that something was fixing to happen. But when I saw the guy under his coat go with the knife, I knew that Billy Ray was at a disadvantage. God, at that time, we didn't know why we did something in prison. You did what your instincts told you to do. And that's what I did.
Billy, I was thinking too, Jody, on the heels of what you were saying. And Billy, I don't know if this helps ease your mind at all, but, just the staring at some of the realism of it, I think it might be fair to say that it's possible, if you hadn't stopped, or rather if you had stopped Billy Ray and he had lived, I mean, he might have taken more lives. You know, he may have killed more people because that's obviously so. I mean, I'm just thinking in some way to lighten that burden of regret that you might feel, in the sense that he clearly seemed to be done with his ride. You know what I mean? He had left a lot of damage, and maybe a lot of damage had been done to him. It's just such an incredible story. But I was going to ask Billy, for example, if you met him on the outside, though, do you think you would have been able to be friends with Billy Ray on the outside?
I don't think, because he was committed to a way of life that I broke away from. If I had met Billy Ray in Houston after I got out, I don't even know if I could have introduced Billy Ray to my wife.
Right, that kind of thing, exactly.
Yeah, you know, you have friendship in a time and in a space, which is what you had.
Exactly.
You had a time and a space there that was confined to a situation, a prison situation. And those situations are so distinctly different from any kind of situation you have in a free world. And, you know, you don't know if you had went to Spain. You know, the song, I've never been to Spain, but I've been to Oklahoma. But, you know, you've been to Oklahoma, but you'd never been to Spain that I know of. So you don't know what you would have encountered there. You don't know if you and he would have been the same kind of friend.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm teasing out, you know, in the story. That's the crux of it, because on one level, I was so struck by that. Of course, he's calling you brother. I do have an actual older brother. Shout out to Chris. But, you know, the brotherhood, these were these were complex men. They're deeply flawed men in many ways. I guess I was one of them, fair to say. I'm thinking of that old Groucho Marx line. Wouldn't want to belong to any club that would have me as a member. But yeah, when you talked about how Billy Ray referred to you in that letter before he died, calling you brother, you know, and the same thing that this Colombian, he would refer to me that way, hermano, brother, just that there was this feeling that we had sort of fought a war. I know prison isn't the same as war, but it's a fringe experience any way you cook it. And that's where that contradiction comes into play, which I feel like is the crux of the story. I loved him. In one sense, he was my brother forever. And then in another, I don't think, like you said, yeah, Billy Ray, you wouldn't have been able to have that bond maybe anywhere else.
Here's the thing about friendships, Cullen. And before I say this, you love the person within a cell next to you. You loved everything he said, the way he treated you, the way he respected you. Relationships in prison border on almost every relationship in prison, and I think you probably know this as well as I, are adversarial. In one way or the other, they're territorial, they're adversarial, or they're hostile. There's inmates that you don't like, and they don't like you. In different ways, you let them know, I don't like you, and I don't want you to like me. And you create space between you and them, and that space is respected. Inmates get killed when they violate that space. And then there are some relation, all relationships are adversarial in the sense that you always wonder what the other man's motives are. If he offers you a cup of coffee, you instinctively say, are you going to want two back?
Right.
No. So you develop a certain paranoia, adversarial relationship. You can respect each other, like each other, and do a whole lot of things together. But there's not a whole lot of trust there. But then you have the relationship, and it's not sexual. There's a lot of people that develop sexual relationships in prison where they love each other in a very deep emotional and physical way.
Yeah, this wasn't that kind, but it's true.
You see this. I've seen a number of these kind of relationships. But you establish a kind of friendship that is a brotherhood.
Yeah.
That the person loves you and you love them. And it may be your desperate need, or it may have been my desperate need, to have this sense of belonging to humanity, to have someone that you completely trusted, someone that you knew, today's terminology, you knew they had your back.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you had with the drug smuggler. He was far more, I believe, sophisticated than you were.
For sure.
You had gotten some drugs and you got caught up in a bad situation and ended up in a foreign prison. He was committed to a way of life. You were not committed to that way of life. And I think that created, whether it was conscious or unconscious, a sense that he needed to not only educate you, but in a certain way protect you, that perhaps you shouldn't go there. Perhaps you shouldn't take that path.
That's interesting. I'm sorry to jump in right there, Billy. I really appreciate what you're saying. The way that Billy Ray said to you, you could be something more, you got to promise me that you're going to find your best self. I know Unincarcerated Productions, I was listening to that spirit that's behind this, which is a beautiful and powerful thing, searching for that giant self, searching for that best self. But the way Billy Ray, saw that in you, and you in that way were able to maybe bring out a side of him that he couldn't share elsewhere. This is something else I've been trying to examine when I flip the script, in a sense. I'm trying to understand on the page what that my prison buddy meant to me, but I'm also trying to flip around and understand who I was to him, because I don't know if he had ever had an American friend. I had never had a Colombian friend. I certainly had never known anybody who, had been convicted of a felony and had been in prison for years. And so, there was that aspect, Billy, this is another thing I was looking forward to talking to you about and to learn from your wisdom. He never talked to me about the drug trade. And it's something that I find myself in the story trying to explain almost to the reader in the sense that I feel like I have to disclaim that, because I feel like a reader might be like, oh yeah, come on, we don't believe that. Like this Colombian narco trafficker, and you're in there too for having tried to mail a kilo of Philippine hashish to yourself in South Korea. Like, come on, you guys didn't speak about drugs. But the honest truth is our friendship was based on a different level. He did not share with me that side of his life. In fact, he denied that he was involved in cocaine, which is something I still grapple with. It bothered me then, and it bothers me now. I don't know if that was true for you too, Billy. I think maybe it was, but the sense of you weren't maybe one of those prisoners who simply felt like, well, I'm just the guys who always pled innocent. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where everyone in there is innocent, and he wasn't like that, but sometimes, apparently he didn't
want to be defined by the popular definition of what a drug smuggler was. Particularly at that time, he didn't want to be, because cocaine smugglers do not have a good reputation worldwide. I mean, Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel and the Cubans. The one thing I find as a little anecdote, the one thing I found that was so interesting was the three Colombians I knew is how much they detested Cubans. I mean, there was just the movie Scarface with Al Pacino showed how that war that took place between the Colombians and Cubans in Miami in the 1980s. There's a lot of truth in that. I mean, between the two. But if you look at, if you tried to equate them with a Cuban drug smuggler or someone that would be a part of the Mexican drug card, they would be highly offended. We're not like that, and they would let you know real quick that, hey, we don't do business like they do. We do business a different way. And this emerald smuggler may in his mind have seen emerald smuggling as a class above cocaine smuggling.
Absolutely. I think that's right on. The way I said it in the story is like that beautiful green is far more palatable than that nasty white.
Yeah.
The green. Yeah, I think that is a big part of it. The emeralds have a mystique and a kind of grandeur And obviously cocaine is a nasty business. It was disappointing to me. Part of my story is also, and I'm curious to hear, Billy, how you might describe this too, because I guess in the end, there's a disappointment for me. I mean, what did I expect? Like you said, these guys are very often in it for life, both willingly and maybe because of circumstance and their destinies, if one believes in such a thing. But yeah, that
it's sort of like this. The three Colombians I knew, the one that had since passed, he was the leader of the group. And you could look at Miguel, and he was a strong individual, and you knew he was dangerous. Quintero Cruz, was a trigger man. He's the one that gunned Barry Seal down in front of that halfway house there in Baton Rouge in 1986. And he had a MAC-10 machine gun, and Barry Seal had just gotten his Cadillac when Cruz come up from behind the bin, a clothes drop-off bin, and opened fire on him inside the car and killed him. But if you look at him and his behavior and his demeanor in prison, half the time you just want to walk up and bitch slap him, because he invited that kind of contempt. He was not a strong man. He was not a dangerous man. But Miguel and the other one, Bernardo, they were both, and you could tell, wholly different kind of people. Well, later I would learn that Cruz was brought from a village in Colombia where most of the drug assassins came from. When Escobar and these people got you, and Carlos Ledier, when they got all their hit people, they went to this one village in Colombia where a lot of these hit people were. They impoverished village, so they would go to Medellin or they would go to Cali, and that's where they found work and opportunity. Although it was on the dark side of opportunity, they found it. And so you didn't get the kind of quality, if I can use that term, kind of quality person that's why Cruz never measured up to being what Bernardo or Miguel was. He just didn't fit in that category. Yet he's the one that actually gunned Barry Seal down. But how much courage does it take to jump out from behind a bin and pull off 30 rounds out of a MAC-10 machine gun and kill somebody? That's the difference. So that, from what you tell me about your friend, I started to get the sense that he was around a particular class of people before he went to prison that was not like that stereotypical drug smuggler or smuggler of any sense.
There are some other people that, if time permits, Billy could mention that he's told me about when he was on death row. After 6 months, the guards always handed out these drugs, so he just took the drugs, put his head in the toilet, and kept flushing it over and over again to deny where he was. But when he finally stopped that, an inmate by the name of Swede, who always went around naked in protest on death row, he came and gave Billy a bunch of books by Sartre and top philosophers and so forth. And Billy had to get a dictionary and read through all of them. And then there was a much older inmate, black guy on death row, who came by and he changed Billy's mind. Billy was a redneck dude from North Louisiana where people were prejudiced against black people. But Emmett used to come around to the new guy, the new boy. I think he kind of thought of Billy as a child on death row, say, "Boy, what you doing with all them books?" So Billy taught him to read. And then Emmett got very sick and the guards ignored him and he died. And that made a huge change in Billy's life, because that sent him down a path of becoming a jailhouse lawyer so that he could help file appeals for inmates, so that he could fight for prison conditions to be better, so that you don't get a prison guard who says, "Well, I'm sorry, Emmett, I know that you're in pain, but not a damn thing I can do because we don't have a car today to take you over to the hospital in the prison." These are the kind of things. So the stories are difficult because, for one thing, in the intro it said, anyone listening will see the brutality that resides in prison, absolute brutality. But then there's the compassion that appears so unexpectedly in people like Swede and in people like Emmett, and then down the road in people like Erwin Bro, Life, who helped Billy under orders of the administration, help them integrate Angola. And then Life is stabbed to death after trying to protect young prisoners who just come to Angola, protect them from rape. Those kinds of stories as well are not the kinds of things that people think of happening in prison. People trying to save people. I think Billy Ray was trying to save Billy Sinclair. I think your friend, I don't know his name, but he was trying to save you. He was trying in those few months that he had before he knew he was coming to the end of his sentence. He was trying to imbue you with enough knowledge and power and feeling of strength to save yourself.
Mm-hmm.
The thing, Cullen, to show you how humanity can have different shapes and colors in prison. When Life and I, we were working with the Justice Department, U.S. Justice Department, and the prison administration. And the Justice Department had given the prison system so much time to integrate the prison. This was in 1973. It was still segregated. So Life and I were able to convince the administration that we had a plan that we could implement that would be far less dangerous and least likely to create a race riot if they let us do it our way. So ultimately, they bought into our plan, and the Justice Department did the same thing, and they give us a week to integrate the prison. And through that week, Life and I were able, he on the black end, me on the white end, and both of us together in the middle, were able to not only implement the plan, but to put the inmates in dormitories that we knew fit each other. We knew who to put where, and we were allowed to do that. And we managed to integrate the big yard at Angola without a single fist fight. It was so remarkable, probably one of the more remarkable things that I ever accomplished in my life. And to this day, and Life and I both really didn't know how we did that. But a sidebar to that is that Billy Ray knew that he could not accept the integration of the prison. He felt compelled to stand his ground and say no. He had a lot of influence among the white guys, but he also knew that would bring him potentially in direct conflict with me because he knew what I was doing. He was not going to have that conflict. So he escaped from the prison during the middle of the integration plan, and he was eventually chased down by the prison chase crew, and he managed to kill their prize bloodhound before they were able to get the handcuffs on him. And he was placed in cell block. Now, he did that, and that escape, ironically, distracted security long enough for us, for Life and I, to do some things in terms of who we were putting where and what we were doing to make our plan happen without security interference. So once again, Billy Ray chose to protect me by doing that because it wasn't that he wanted to see the plan work. He just wanted to make sure that I didn't get hurt while the plan was being carried out. And so that's the kind of humanity you come across in relationships in prison, that a guy would do that. And Life and I both knew why Billy Ray did that. I mean, Life knew why. Life and I were good friends. We had a particular bond. But the relationship that we had was not built on the same principles of the relationship that Billy Ray and I had. What Life and I had was a relationship of mutual respect, mutual trust, and mutual well-being. We looked after each other's well-being. Billy Ray and I had that relationship that we were like brothers. And the bond there was just unbreakable and unshakable. And so, you have these kind of relationships in prison, and they define who you are. Earlier, I said these relationships had the capacity to define you. After Billy Ray died, I knew I didn't know how it was going to be done. I knew that I was going to walk away from that criminal code, that criminal mindset. I didn't know how I was going to get there. I didn't know how I was going to get from point A to point Z, but I knew how I was going to get there. It's just like I knew when I went into Angola that I would change that prison before the prison would ever change me. And Billy Ray's one of the people that I met in that prison, as was Life and Emmett, who helped me change the prison. And when I walked out after 20 years, believe you me, I had changed it. I had changed it. Unlike anything that any inmate had ever done over that 20 years, was a lot of change that was brought about by things that I was involved in. I did. And that's not braggadocious. That's just the fact. And a whole lot of them I never knew. Who would have knew that during a period in a maximum security prison that I would be sitting on ABC's Nightline with Chief Justice Warren Burger?
Yeah, amazing.
Who could have possibly believed that night that Billy Ray died? Who would believe that just in 10 years from that point, I would be with the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court? I would go from a lockdown cell watching a brother chew the veins out of his arms to sitting there talking to a Chief Justice on the same level that he was speaking, and in fact, inspiring him with the things that we were saying. I mean, how does that happen? I don't know. I'm just an old country boy from North Louisiana. At the time, I didn't know what I was doing, but I was able to get it done. But when you get things done, it's because somewhere along the way, people help you. It's just like when I got out, I survived and became what I am today because Jody was there. Believe you me, Cullen, that I say this with all deliberate speed, that when I stood that first day out of prison, I looked out of our penthouse at downtown Houston, and I said, motherfuck, how am I going to survive? How am I going to deal with this? I didn't have the slightest idea.
You were away for a long time, Billy.
Oh, but this young lady, she said, well, we're going to do it by process. She's the one that encouraged me to go to community college. She's the one that encouraged me to start taking legal courses in Texas law. And she's the one that paid for it, because I wasn't working then. So, if it hadn't have been for her and the network of people that she had around her, I wonder, would I have ended up a homeless person under I-45? Or would I have been able to go on and accomplish what I've accomplished in the 15 years that I've been out?
Well, I think that this conversation, Cullen, between you and Billy will certainly go a long way toward making people think about prison reform, because people should not have to make the kinds of decisions that they make behind bars, the kind that you all have talked about, because there's no other way to live life when you're incarcerated. So this is a big shout out to people. This is what people go through. This is the kind of brutality, as I said in the intro, that exists inside prison. And sort of now that we're at the end, I have looked up that final letter from Billy Ray White, which he wrote, and he addressed Billy Sinclair, my beloved brother Billy. It's a long letter. At the end, he says, I would proudly die for you. Is it wrong of me to ask you to let me go now? Is it greedy? You're not heavy. You're my brother, my only brother, and I love you, and my death won't separate us. And that is the letter in his handwriting that he gave to Billy when he took his own life.
And it had his blood on it.
So I think that if anything, while I know that this conversation helps you with the work that you're doing, it is my sincere hope and my sincere prayer that it will help other people understand the brutality that lives behind bars and the way that people have to deal with that brutality, ways in which they would never probably live in the outside world, nor should they ever be forced to live that way. So I thank you a lot, Cullen, for sharing with us. And I sincerely hope that this conversation lets people know that there are enormous changes that have to take place in the American criminal justice system, or there is no justice.
And I feel the same way, Cullen. I take a great deal of pride and a sense of accomplishment being able to talk to you and to share experiences with you. And I hope that I've helped you as much as you've inspired me. So, the people who listen to this, I hope that they understand that there's humanity in prison. There are bad things in prison. It's not a nice place. Vic and Spencer know about prison. They know about the dark side of prison and what it's like. But they also know that there's a humanity to prison, and that's why they're doing the work that they're doing now and try to get our bosses, people like you and me, to get our bosses out there to the public.
Yeah, absolutely. Amen to that, Jody, Billy. Just an honor and a pleasure. It really is. And I saw that with Unincarcerated Productions. It's a brotherhood and a sisterhood linked in many ways by that same crucible experience. So I thought that just was dynamite.
Well, I never thought my life would take this. I would live this course in my life, not the way that I was reared, but I do feel it's a privilege. And I do think that all of us need to speak up now when prison reform is possible. These stories need to come out because we have an obligation to speak up, to let people know now that there's an audience that wants to know this is the way that it is, and it has to change.
Now you go take care of your class, young man.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Billy, you lost a friend who protected you when you were released into general population after you left death row in Louisiana. He asked you to witness his death, and out of loyalty, you did. Cullen, you renewed a friendship with a Colombian inmate who befriended you in a prison in South Korea when you were just 23. He was murdered years later in Spain, and you will never know, as you said, if he'd gone straight, and that you should have visited him to thank him in person. So thank you, Billy, and thank you too, Cullen, for sharing these brutal facts about what it is really like behind bars.
This podcast comes from Unincarcerated Productions and Grindle Industries. Every episode of Justice Delayed is produced and edited by Cameron Collins and Milo Bershane. Music on this episode is from Speculation. Learn more and check out Spec at speculation.bandcamp.com. That's spekulation.bandcamp.com. And of course, head on over to unincarcerated.com to find out more about Unincarcerated Productions. We will see you all next time.